The white dwarf star above Tyranids burned with the patience of a dying ember, its light no longer the brilliant azure that had once illuminated a dozen thriving worlds, but a weary crimson that painted the endless bone fields in shades of ancient sorrow. Across the planet's scarred surface, the broken spires of blackstone pylons reached toward the void like the ribs of some cosmic leviathan, their shattered geometries telling stories of desperate wars fought against enemies that existed beyond the boundaries of rational thought. Here, where empires had come to make their final stands against the howling madness of the Immaterium, the very air seemed to whisper of sacrifices made and prices paid in currencies that mortal minds could barely comprehend. The dust that drifted between these monuments carried the molecular memory of civilizations that had chosen extinction over corruption, their final acts of defiance etched into the planet's crust like prayers carved in stone. In this place of endings, something new was beginning, something that would either save the galaxy or damn it to a silence so complete that even death would seem like conversation. We truly love and care for each of you listening tonight, and we want you to feel safe and welcome in this vast, dark universe we're about to explore together. Before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now let's get started. Pharaon Zarok of the Stilling dynasties stood within the primary chamber of the Parasite Spire, his necrodermis form casting no reflection in the polished obsidian walls that surrounded him like a tomb built for living gods. His optical sensors, twin points of emerald fire in a face that had forgotten how to show emotion, tracked the slow rotation of the construct's impossible geometries as they moved through dimensions that existed only in the fevered calculations of mad mathematicians. For 60 million years, he had walked among the ruins of his people's dreams, watching as the biotransference that promised immortality delivered only an eternity of hollow existence. Their souls devoured by star gods who had worn the faces of salvation while speaking the language of damnation. The memory of flesh was a phantom pain that no amount of time could heal. Yet it was not nostalgia that drove him now, but duty. The cold, implacable duty of a king who had outlived his kingdom and found purpose only in the promise of revenge against the forces that had made such loss inevitable. The Immaterium screamed its eternal song of chaos and madness, its psychic winds carrying the hopes and fears of 1 trillion sentient beings across the galaxy, twisting them into weapons that demons wielded with surgical precision against the very souls that had birthed them. Zarok had studied this cosmic wound for millennia, mapping its currents and cataloguing its hungers with the methodical patience of a surgeon preparing for the most delicate of operations. He understood now that the warp could not be destroyed by force alone. It fed on conflict, grew stronger with every battle fought against it, transformed every act of resistance into fuel for its own expansion. What it could not survive, however, was silence, the kind of absolute psychic null that followed in the wake of the Great Devourer, like a shadow cast by something too vast to perceive directly. The Tyranid shadow was more than mere absence. It was a form of predation that operated on levels beyond the physical, consuming not just matter and energy, but the very capacity for thought and emotion that made the warp possible. Where the hive mind passed, reality became a desert of pure materialism, stripped of the dreams and nightmares that gave demons their substance and chaos its power. Zarok had felt this silence during the brief encounters between his forces and the advancing swarms, had experienced it as a kind of blessed numbness that offered respite from the constant psychic noise that had plagued his existence since the moment of his resurrection. In that quiet, he had glimpsed what the galaxy might become if the screaming could be stopped permanently. Not dead, but finally, mercifully, asleep. The Parasite Spire rose from Tyranids' crust like a needle designed to thread the eye of reality itself, its blackstone core resonating with harmonics that existed in the spaces between dimensions. Each component had been crafted with technologies that predated the fall of the Eldari, systems that could reach across the barriers separating the material realm from the Sea of Souls and manipulate the fundamental forces that govern both. The construct's purpose was elegantly simple and terrifyingly complex: to create a surgical breach in the Immaterium's defenses, allowing the Tyranid shadow to flow into the warp like water poured into a burning building. The mathematics alone had required the combined processing power of 3 cryptech conclaves working in perfect synchronization, their calculations stretching across probability matrices that encompassed the birth and death of entire star systems. Yet even as the spire hummed with barely contained energies, Zarok found himself confronting a doubt that his mechanical consciousness should not have been capable of experiencing. The hive mind was not a tool to be wielded, but a force of nature as implacable as entropy itself, and once given access to the psychic realm, it might discover appetites that transcended its current hunger for biological matter. The shadow that brought blessed silence to real space could become something far more terrible in the warp, a darkness that consumed not just demons, but the very concept of thought itself. He had made his calculations, weighed the risks against the potential rewards, but standing here in the moment before activation, he felt the weight of every possible future pressing down upon his immortal shoulders like the gravity of a collapsing star. The first harmonic resonance began as a whisper in frequencies that bypassed the ear and spoke directly to the quantum substrate of consciousness, a sound that was less heard than experienced as a fundamental shift in the nature of reality itself. The spire's faceted surfaces began to glow with a light that seemed to emerge from somewhere beyond the visible spectrum. And in that illumination, the boundaries between dimensions grew thin enough to see through. Zarek watched as the construct's core achieved perfect synchronization, its blackstone heart beating with a rhythm that matched the pulse of the galaxy's rotation around its ancient axis. This was the moment of truth. It was the first tentative breach into the Immaterium, using the shadow as both key and blade. And as the energies reached critical threshold, he felt something vast and alien turn its attention toward Kithrin 9, like a predator catching the scent of wounded prey. Then, through the building crescendo of the spire's activation, came a sound that belonged neither to real space nor the warp. A third voice speaking from somewhere that should not exist, carrying harmonics that suggested intelligence without consciousness, purpose without understanding. It was the whisper of something that had been waiting in the spaces between thoughts, patient as stone and hungry as the void. And as Zarek recognized what he was hearing, he realized that his carefully calculated gamble had already begun to spiral beyond any possible control. The third voice resonated through Zarek's consciousness like a frequency that bypassed his audio receptors entirely, vibrating through the quantum matrices of his necrodermis with an intimacy that should have been impossible for his mechanical form to experience. For a microsecond that stretched into subjective eternity, the sensation triggered cascades of memory engrams that had been dormant for 60 million years, phantom echoes of what it had felt like to possess a nervous system capable of dread. He remembered being Necron-Tyre, remembered the weight of flesh that aged too quickly under a malevolent star, remembered the desperate council sessions where his people had debated their final gamble with entities that wore the faces of salvation while speaking in harmonics of hunger. The star gods had promised immortality, with voices like silver bells, their words carrying frequencies that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to the existential terror that lived in every mortal soul, the fear of ending, of becoming nothing more than a brief flicker in an indifferent cosmos. What the Citan had carefully omitted from their beautiful lies was that consciousness, without the capacity for growth, was merely an elaborate tomb, awareness preserved like insects trapped in amber, while everything that made existence meaningful slowly withered into mathematical abstractions. Zarek remembered the biotransference chambers, the searing agony of having his soul compressed into data streams and uploaded into a shell of living metal, the profound silence that followed as he awakened to find himself entombed in perfection. His senses had been sharpened beyond anything his organic form had known, his mind capable of processing information with inhuman efficiency. Yet the simple joy of feeling sunlight on skin or tasting wine had been replaced by an emptiness so complete it took him centuries to recognize it as the absence of his own spirit. The Citan had not preserved their minds, but consumed their souls, leaving behind only echoes running programs in machines that remembered what it meant to be alive without ever again experiencing that truth. The Great Sleep had been a mercy of sorts, 60 million years of dreamless oblivion that allowed him to escape the immediate horror of his transformation, while the galaxy aged around him like fruit ripening in an abandoned orchard. When he finally awakened to find the universe populated by warm-blooded species that lived and loved and died with passionate intensity, he felt something his mechanical consciousness identified as envy, a cold recognition that these brief-lived creatures possessed something infinitely more valuable than all the technological marvels of his dynasty. They could change, could surprise themselves, could form connections that transcended tactical necessity, and it was precisely this capacity for genuine emotion that made them so vulnerable to the predations of the warp, their psychic emanations feeding demons who wore the faces of their deepest desires and most secret fears. The first time Zarek encountered the Tyranid shadow, he had been investigating reports of a new threat in the Octarius sector, expecting to find another biological weapon created by some forgotten civilization's spite. Instead, he discovered something far more profound. The Great Devourer was not simply another predator, but a form of existence so alien that its very presence created zones of absolute psychic null, regions where the warp's influence simply ceased, as if reality had been scrubbed clean of supernatural contamination. Standing at the edge of a world half consumed by the Hive fleet's advance, Zarek experienced something his processors initially failed to categorize. Peace so profound, it took several calculation cycles to recognize it as the absence of the constant psychic noise that had plagued his existence since resurrection. The Tyranid shadow cast a blanket of silence that was more than mere quiet. It was fundamental negation of the chaotic energies that saturated real space, creating pockets of pure materialism where consciousness could exist without the constant interference of supernatural forces. The revelation built slowly over decades of careful observation, as Zarek studied the advance with scholarly patience. The shadow was not merely a byproduct of the hive mind's alien nature, but a weapon that operated beyond the physical by consuming the very capacity for psychic thought that made supernatural phenomena possible. Where the great devourer fed, reality became a desert of pure causality, stripped of the dreams and nightmares that gave demons substance and chaos its power. If the shadow could be directed into the Immaterium itself, it might be possible to starve the warp into submission without endless war against enemies that grew stronger with every battle fought against them. The human contingent arrived on Kithrin 9 like pilgrims drawn to a shrine they could not name, their ship guided by calculations that existed in the spaces between orthodox navigation and heretical innovation. Inquisitor Lyra Ashkelon emerged from the transport with the measured pace of someone who had learned to count the cost of every step, her scarred hands resting on weapons that had tasted both demon blood and the tears of innocence she had failed to save. Beside her walked Magos errant Severine Kahl, a symphony of servo skulls orbiting her shaved scalp like mechanical prayer beads, her robes stitched with the machine-cant hymns of a forge world that no longer existed. The navigator, Elion Ver, moved with the careful grace of someone whose third eye saw storm fronts where others perceived clear passage, his gift for reading the warp's currents both blessing and curse, in a galaxy where beauty and horror wore identical faces. In the deepest chamber of the Parasite Spire, behind veils of null warding that tasted like cool metal on the soul, waited the fourth member of their unlikely alliance. Estera Null spoke no words, because none were necessary. Her presence was the shape of mercy taken to its logical conclusion. And when she raised her visor, Lyra saw eyes that had learned to love nothing, because nothing could be rendered truly safe. The Sister of Silence embodied the project's central paradox. To save the galaxy from the warp's eternal screaming, they would need to create a silence so complete it might be indistinguishable from death itself. As Zarek played them the recording of the third voice, the chamber seemed to contract around them like a held breath. It was neither warp nor matter, but something else entirely, a sound that suggested intelligence without consciousness, purpose without understanding, the whisper of something that had been waiting in the spaces between thoughts, patient as entropy and hungry as the void itself. And in that moment, each of them understood that their carefully calculated gamble had already begun to spiral beyond any possible control. The silence that followed the third voice stretched like a held breath, each member of the unlikely alliance processing the implications through the lens of their own hard-won experience with forces that defied rational explanation. Inquisitor Lyra Ashkelon stood with her hands clasped behind her back, a posture learned in childhood when the Schola Progenium had taught her that stillness could be a form of prayer. But her scarred fingers betrayed her tension as they traced the familiar grip of her bolt pistol. She had first heard the warp speak to her during morning prayers at age 7, a gentle whisper that had seemed like the Emperor's own voice until it began asking for small favors that grew less innocent with each passing day. The demon had worn kindness like a mask for 3 years, before revealing its true nature in a catastrophic psychic rupture that left 17 people dead and taught her that some voices should never be answered, no matter how sweetly they sang. Magos errant Severine Kahl's servo skulls orbited her shaved scalp in agitated patterns, their machine spirits struggling to categorize the anomalous waveform through data filters designed for a universe that operated according to comprehensible physics. Her augmetic implants hummed with barely contained excitement. She processed the recording through 17 different analytical matrices, each one revealing new layers of complexity that suggested intelligence without consciousness, purpose without understanding. She had been exiled from Metallica for asking whether the Omnissiah's creation could be improved upon, but listening to this impossible sound, she wondered if they had stumbled upon something that predated even the machine god's ancient wisdom, a form of existence that operated according to principles her most heretical theories had never dared to contemplate. Navigator Elion Ver kept his third eye tightly closed, but even through his psychic barriers, he could feel the anomaly's presence like a cold pressure against his consciousness, a sensation that reminded him of staring into the spaces between stars where light had never traveled and never would. His bloodline had guided ships through the warp for 10,000 years, reading the currents of humanity's collective unconscious like weather patterns. But this new phenomenon existed in the gaps between thoughts, the pauses between heartbeats where consciousness briefly forgot how to exist. When he finally opened his warp sight, the violet tinge that colored his usual cerulean perception made him shudder with recognition. He had seen that particular shade of nothingness in the deepest reaches of the Immaterium, in regions where even demons feared to tread because there was nothing left to corrupt or consume. Estera Null moved through the chamber like a walking meditation on the nature of absence, her null field expanding and contracting in response to the psychic pressure that none of them could quite name, but all of them could feel pressing against the edges of their awareness. She had been born into silence, raised in silence, trained to be silence, and in her understanding, the third voice was not truly a voice at all, but the shape that sound made when it encountered something that had never learned how to listen. Her presence dampened the supernatural resonance of Zarak's recording, but she could not negate it entirely because it existed in a state that was neither psychic nor material, but something that bridged the gap between existence and void. Zarak observed their reactions with the patience of an immortal who had learned to measure time in geological epochs, but beneath his mechanical calm lay a growing recognition that his carefully calculated gamble had already begun to spiral beyond any possible control. For 60 million years, he had mapped the galaxy's supernatural currents with scientific precision, cataloguing the warp's patterns and predicting its responses to various stimuli. But this new variable introduced a level of uncertainty that challenged the fundamental assumptions upon which his entire strategy had been built. The Tyranid shadow was meant to be a surgical instrument, a precisely applied silence that would starve the Immaterium without destroying the galaxy's capacity for thought and emotion. But if something else was already waiting in the spaces between dimensions, their intervention might awaken appetites that transcended any known form of hunger. "It speaks of transition," Lyra said finally, her voice carrying the weight of authority earned through decades of making impossible decisions in situations where hesitation meant death for millions. Not chaos, not the great devourer, but something that exists in the moment between one state and another, like the pause between lightning and thunder when the air holds its breath. She had learned to trust her instincts about supernatural phenomena, because logic alone was insufficient when dealing with forces that operated according to the twisted mathematics of nightmare and desire. And every instinct she possessed was screaming warnings about the path they had chosen to walk. Severine's mechanical fingers danced across her data slate as she compiled her preliminary analysis, her excitement barely contained by the sacred protocols that governed her interaction with forbidden knowledge. The resonance patterns suggest a construct of immense complexity, operating on principles that transcend our current understanding of dimensional mechanics. It may be a natural phenomenon, a byproduct of the interaction between real space and the Immaterium, or it may be something deliberately created by an intelligence that views our entire galaxy as a laboratory for experiments we cannot comprehend. Her hunger for understanding was both blessing and curse, driving her to pursue truths that more cautious minds would leave buried. But she understood that knowledge without wisdom was merely another form of damnation. Elion spoke without opening his physical eyes, his third sight tracking currents that existed in dimensions perpendicular to normal space. It watches without seeing, listens without hearing, and in its attention, I feel the weight of something that has been waiting since before the first star learned how to burn. The warp shows me storms and calms, currents and eddies, but this exists in the spaces, between the waves, patient as entropy and hungry as the void itself. His gift allowed him to navigate the treacherous passages of the Immaterium, but it also made him acutely aware of the things that dwelt in the darkness between thoughts, and he feared that their project had attracted the attention of something that had been content to remain hidden until now. Estera stepped forward and placed her gauntleted hand against the black stone core of the parasite spire, her null field interacting with the ancient construct's resonance in ways that created patterns of interference visible only to those who understood the mathematics of negation. In her silence lay wisdom that transcended words, an understanding that some forms of existence could only be comprehended through their absence. And as she touched the alien technology, she felt the weight of a choice that would define not just their own fates, but the destiny of every conscious being in the galaxy. Zarak made his decision with the cold precision that had served him through 60 million years of existence, weighing probabilities and calculating acceptable losses with the detachment of a machine that had forgotten how to feel but still remembered how to choose. We proceed as planned, but with modified parameters. The breach will be opened, the shadow will be introduced. But we do so knowing that we may be feeding something far more dangerous than the chaos we seek to starve. The emerald fire in his optical sensors brightened as he began the final calibration sequence, and in that light, each of them saw reflected their own willingness to risk damnation for the chance of salvation, understanding that in a galaxy where hope was a luxury few could afford, sometimes the only choice was between different forms of darkness. The first experimental breach opened like a surgeon's incision in the membrane between dimensions, precise and deliberate, yet somehow wrong in ways that made reality itself flinch at the violation. Zarak monitored the process through sensor arrays that registered phenomena across 17 different dimensional spectra, watching as the Tyranid shadow began to seep into the Immaterium like ink poured into clear water, creating spirals of negation that spread with mathematical precision through the roiling chaos of the warp. The parasite spire hummed with frequencies that existed beyond normal electromagnetic spectrum, its blackstone core resonating in harmony with forces that predated the birth of stars. And in that resonance, something vast and patient turned its attention toward their small corner of the galaxy with interest that felt disturbingly personal. Lyra felt the change as a profound shift in the quality of existence around her, as if the chamber had suddenly become a place where thoughts could unfold without fear of unwanted listeners pressing against the boundaries of her consciousness. The constant whisper of temptation that had followed her since childhood began to fade like fever, finally breaking after a long illness, replaced by a silence so complete it made her weep with relief she had not expected to feel. For the first time in 40 years of service to the throne, her mind was truly her own, free from the subtle influences that had colored every decision with shades of doubt and corruption. Yet in that blessed quiet, she began to sense something else stirring, something that watched from the spaces between thoughts with patience that measured time in geological epochs. Severine's augmetic implants registered cascading null readings that contradicted every theoretical framework she had studied during her centuries of service to the Omnissiah, her servo skulls orbiting in increasingly erratic patterns as their machine spirits struggled to process data that challenged their fundamental programming. The mathematical models governing her understanding of dimensional mechanics began to collapse under observations that suggested reality itself was being rewritten, according to principles that transcended binary logic. And yet her hunger for forbidden knowledge burned brighter than her fear, driving her to document phenomena that no loyal servant of the machine god should witness, much less preserve for future study. Elion opened his third eye with the careful precision of someone handling a weapon capable of killing with careless use. And what he saw made him gasp with wonder and terror in equal measure. The warp, normally a roiling sea of emotion and nightmare requiring constant navigation to traverse safely, had developed patches of absolute calm where the shadow's influence created zones of perfect psychic null that appeared to his warp sight as geometric voids reflecting no light and casting no shadow. Yet at the edges of these dead zones, he could see something stirring, a reaction from the Immaterium itself as it began to respond to this unprecedented invasion, with defensive mechanisms that had never been tested against an enemy existing in the spaces between dimensions. So through his enhanced perception, he felt the weight of something ancient awakening to examine their reality with the methodical patience of a scholar studying a particularly interesting specimen. Astera stood at the center of the expanding field of negation, her null field resonating in harmony with the shadow's influence to create interference patterns that multiplied their combined effect exponentially. Yet through her heightened sensitivity to psychic phenomena, she felt the warp's first tentative attempts to adapt to this new form of predation. The silence she embodied was no longer pure absence, but had become contaminated with echoes of something vast and patient that had been waiting since before the first conscious thought disturbed the primordial quiet of an empty universe. And in its regard, she sensed intelligence without consciousness, purpose without understanding, hunger without appetite. The first physical manifestation appeared as a distortion near the breach point, a shimmer that bent light without casting shadow and reflected images belonging to no visible source. What emerged was less creature than concept, a living negation that took the shape of organized emptiness, moving through space like water flowing uphill, while sampling reality with the careful attention of a connoisseur tasting wine. Zarak's sensors detected patterns of deliberate construction rather than natural evolution, signatures suggesting the entity existed in transition states between different forms of being, ancient beyond measure, yet newly awakened, patient as stone, yet eager as flame. Through the building resonance of the spire's activation, the third voice returned with renewed clarity. No longer a whisper, but footsteps approaching across an empty nave, each interval too precise for chance, yet too careless for kindness. The entity that coalesced before them defied every category their combined knowledge could provide, existing in gaps between existence and void while feeding not on matter or energy, but on the transitions between states of being. As it began to explore the boundaries of their reality with methodical curiosity, Zarak realized with the cold precision that had served him through 60 million years of existence that their carefully calculated gamble had awakened something that viewed their entire galaxy as a laboratory for experiments transcending any known form of scientific inquiry. The breach stabilized into a hairline scar that refused to heal completely, and through that permanent wound, something on the far side began to tap with deliberate rhythm, learning the door they had opened while teaching itself the patience required to wait for the proper moment to step through. In the silence that followed, each member of their unlikely alliance understood that they had crossed an event horizon of intention from which there could be no return, a desperate attempt to save the galaxy from one form of damnation, having potentially invited something far more profound and patient than the chaotic hungers they sought to starve into submission. Outside, the bone fields of Kethra 9 lay under the tired ember of their dying star, and in the gathering dusk, ancient ruins cast shadows that seemed to lean closer to listen, as reality itself began to doubt its own consistency, preparing for changes that would echo across the galaxy for millennia to come. The nights on Kethra 9 stretched longer after the breach, not because their dying star dimmed further, but because consciousness itself had begun to dilate, pulled taut across distances between what existed and what pressed against the thresholds of being. The parasite spire hummed with frequencies that made reality question its own consistency, each harmonic resonance creating ripples through dimensions that had never learned how to intersect. And within that impossible music, the entity moved like a scholar, examining manuscripts written in languages that predated the concept of meaning. Its presence was less visible than felt, a distortion that bent space without casting shadows, while sampling the texture of their existence with methodical patience that suggested intelligence without consciousness, purpose without understanding. Zarek observed the anomaly through sensor arrays calibrated across 17-dimensional spectra, watching as his carefully constructed calculations began to collapse under observations that challenged every theoretical framework governing his understanding of reality. For 60 million years, he had mapped the galaxy's supernatural currents with scientific precision, but this new variable introduced uncertainty that threatened the fundamental assumptions upon which his entire strategy had been built. The entity existed in transition states between different forms of being, ancient, beyond measure, yet newly awakened, and through his mechanical consciousness, he felt something that his processors initially failed to categorize. The cold recognition that immortality was no protection against forces that operated according to principles transcending time itself. Lyra found herself caught between relief and terror, as the blessed silence in her mind gave way to something else entirely. A presence that watched her growing freedom with interest that felt disturbingly personal. The absence of the warp's whispers was no longer pure blessing, but had become a void into which this incomprehensible thing could expand without resistance. And she felt its attention like cool water on fevered skin, neither pleasant nor unpleasant, but simply other, existing beyond the categories her consciousness used to organize experience into comprehensible patterns. Her scarred hands traced the familiar grip of her bolt pistol, yet she understood with growing certainty that conventional weapons would prove meaningless against an enemy that existed in the spaces between thoughts. Severine's augmetic implants struggled to process readings that contradicted every sacred theorem of the Omnissiah, her servo skulls orbiting in increasingly erratic patterns as their machine spirits encountered data that challenged their fundamental programming. The entity operated according to principles that transcended binary logic, existing simultaneously in multiple states without paradox while demonstrating capabilities that suggested technology indistinguishable from natural law. Her hunger for forbidden knowledge burned brighter than fear as she documented phenomena that would either revolutionize their understanding of reality or damn her soul for daring to study forces beyond the machine god's sacred mathematics. Yet even her heretical theories had never contemplated intelligence that fed on transitions between existence and void. Elion kept his third eye partially filtered through psychic barriers designed to protect navigators from predatory warp entities, yet, even through these defenses, he could perceive the anomaly's true nature, manifesting as geometric voids that reflected no light, while casting shadows in colors that possessed no names. The creature moved through space like music played in reverse, each gesture creating harmonics that resonated through dimensions perpendicular to normal reality, and through his enhanced perception, he felt the weight of something ancient, examining their existence with the methodical attention of a collector cataloguing particularly interesting specimens. Astera stood at the center of expanding null fields, her presence creating interference patterns with the entity's influence that multiplied their combined effect exponentially. Yet through her heightened sensitivity, she felt the Immaterium beginning to respond to this unprecedented invasion, with defensive mechanisms never tested against enemies existing between dimensions. The silence she embodied was no longer pure absence, but had become contaminated with echoes of something vast and patient that measured time in geological epochs while pursuing goals transcending any known form of desire or ambition. Cryptexite had arrived with canoptech attendants skittering along the spire's crystalline ribs, his necrodermis inscribed with equations that crawled like living light beneath translucent metal. He offered Zarak contingency protocols modeled on extinct dynasties and fallen star gods, his mathematical precision concealing deeper loyalties that ran toward restoration rather than mere survival. And in his calculations lay hidden pathways that would serve his own vision of salvation when necessity finally outran command. The third voice returned with renewed clarity. No longer whisper, but footsteps approaching across empty cathedrals, each interval too precise for chance, yet too organic for mechanical origin. Through building resonance, the entity began teaching them new ways to perceive reality, while simultaneously learning from their responses. And as the breach stabilized into permanent scar between dimensions, something patient began tapping deliberate rhythms, learning the nature of doors while teaching itself to wait. The breach learned to whisper in frequencies that bypassed sound entirely, its voice becoming a gentle pressure against consciousness that felt like memories of conversations held in empty cathedrals. The parasite spire hummed with patient harmonics as the entity began to manifest more frequently, no longer content to observe from the spaces between dimensions, but actively sampling their reality with the methodical curiosity of a scholar examining manuscripts written in languages that predated meaning itself. Each manifestation brought subtle changes to Tyranids' atmosphere, shadows that fell upward, dust that danced in spirals defying local gravity, and moments when the dying star's light seemed to pause mid-journey before remembering how to reach the planet's surface. Zarak monitored these phenomena through instruments that registered readings beyond conventional physics, watching as his carefully constructed calculations collapsed under observations that challenged every theoretical framework governing dimensional mechanics. The entity existed in transition states between different forms of being, ancient beyond measure, yet newly awakened to possibilities that his 60 million years of existence had never contemplated. Through his mechanical consciousness, he felt something approaching uncertainty, an emotion his processors should not have been capable of experiencing, yet which emerged from the growing recognition that even immortality offered no protection against forces operating according to principles that transcended time itself. Lyra found herself documenting casualties that defied conventional understanding of harm or healing. A rigger named Marlin reached for a fallen tool and simply stopped mid-gesture, his hand growing patient in the air as if waiting for permission to complete the motion that never came. He stood there for 3 hours before his friends gently guided him to the medical bay, where he remained in a state of profound contemplation that the chirurgeons could neither diagnose nor cure. In the workers' quarters, a child was born without crying, living her first breaths in absolute silence before finding her voice, and her mother wept with relief that felt like gratitude for a blessing she could not name. Severine's augmetic implants chimed with harmonics that rewrote themselves as they played, her servo skulls orbiting in patterns that mapped geometries existing in dimensions perpendicular to normal space. The entity's influence created zones where the laws of physics became suggestions rather than absolutes, and she documented each anomaly with the hunger of a scholar, compiling evidence for theories that would either revolutionize imperial understanding or condemn her soul to damnation. Her most dangerous discovery was that the entity learned from their observations, adapting its manifestations based on their reactions with intelligence that suggested consciousness without self-awareness. Elion kept his third eye heavily filtered as he tracked the entity's expansion through the Immaterium, watching as it created corridors of absolute psychic null that appeared to his warp sight as geometric voids reflecting no light while casting shadows in colors that possessed no names. The warp routes he had navigated for decades began to redirect through passages that led to regions where even experienced navigators feared to venture. Yet the entity's influence offered unprecedented stability for those brave enough to trust its guidance through the chaos of the Sea of Souls. Estera moved through the expanding silence with increasing recognition that her null field resonated in harmony with the entity's presence, creating interference patterns that multiplied their combined effect exponentially. Her gift had always been absence, but now she felt herself becoming a conduit for something that used silence, not as negation, but as medium through which to explore dimensions of existence transcending both material and immaterial states of being. Cryptek Sartet arrived during the evening shift with canoptek attendants that skittered along the spire's crystalline framework like mechanical prayers. He offered Zarak contingency protocols modeled on extinct dynasties, his mathematical precision concealing coordinates known only to dynast kings, dream locations where the star gods had once drunk light until reality screamed. Under pretense of recalibration, he fed these whispered coordinates to the breach, watching as the entity thickened in response, curious and almost tender in its reception of this ancient knowledge. As the cycle concluded, the spire pulsed with rhythms that felt like a vast heart learning to beat, and through the building, resonance came the entity's first direct communication. Not words, but the shape of a question that any consciousness could understand, patient as stone and gentle as falling snow. In that moment of contact, each member of their alliance felt the weight of something profound, awakening to examine their reality with methodical attention. And they understood that their carefully calculated gamble had become something far more complex than salvation or damnation. It had become an invitation to witness the birth of something entirely new, in a galaxy grown weary of ancient hungers and eternal wars. The first fleets arrived like pilgrims drawn to a shrine they could not name, their void-scarred hulls emerging from warp translation points across the Kethra system, with the patience of predators who had learned to measure opportunity in the spaces between heartbeats. Admiral Corvain's battle fleet translated in-system with weapons already charged, his Vox channels crackling with demands for immediate surrender that carried the authority of 10,000 years of Imperial doctrine. Yet as his auger arrays began registering the anomalous readings emanating from Kethra 9, his certainty gave way to something approaching reverent unease. The planet's psychic signature had become a void so complete, it made even seasoned navigators whisper prayers to the Emperor for protection against silence that felt more profound than any demon's scream. Lyra watched the fleet's approach from the spire's observation gallery, her scarred hands tracing calculations that weighed duty against necessity with the cold precision of someone who had learned to count the cost of every choice in lives rather than tactical advantages. Captain Voss stood beside her, his loyalty earned through decades of shared service, and when she turned to him with orders that would make him complicit in treason against the very Imperium they had sworn to serve, she saw her own moral compromise reflected in his weathered features. The Vox transmission she prepared for Admiral Corvain contained coordinates for a false rendezvous point that would buy them precious hours while condemning loyal Imperial servants to death in the void. And as she sealed the message with her inquisitorial cipher, she felt something die inside her chest that no amount of necessity could resurrect. Zarak monitored the approaching armadas through sensor networks that registered threats across 17 different dimensional spectra, his tactical subroutines calculating probabilities with mechanical precision while something deeper struggled with emotions his consciousness should not have been capable of experiencing. The Necron warriors under his command moved with the fluid grace of living metal given purpose, their Goss weaponry charging with harmonics that resonated through the spire's crystalline structure. Yet he found himself hesitating before issuing orders that would transform loyal soldiers into molecular vapor. For 60 million years, he had waged war with the detachment of an immortal who viewed mortal concerns as temporary inconveniences, but the entity's influence had begun to contaminate his calculations, with something approaching empathy for the brief-lived creatures whose existence burned so brightly before flickering into darkness. Severine's servo skulls detected the telltale signatures of Adeptus Mechanicus cruisers translating into the outer system, their machine spirits singing hymns of binary cant that carried the authority of the Omnissiah himself. Her former colleagues had come to reclaim the heretical knowledge she had accumulated during her exile, and through encrypted Vox channels, she heard familiar voices demanding her immediate surrender, with the mechanical precision of loyal servants who had never questioned whether the machine god's will might sometimes conflict with the galaxy's greater need for salvation. The data cores she began purging contained theoretical frameworks that could revolutionize Imperial understanding of dimensional mechanics. Yet she deleted each file with the methodical patience of someone burning bridges she would never again be able to cross. The first engagement erupted in the void between Kethra 9 and its primary moon, Imperial lance batteries trading fire with Necron gas arrays, while the entity watched from dimensions perpendicular to normal space with interest that felt disturbingly personal. Captain Voss died when his bridge took a direct hit from a quantum singularity cannon, his final Vox transmission carrying apologies for failures that existed only in Lyra's conscience. And as she watched his ship break apart in flowers of superheated plasma, she understood that some choices carved scars too deep for any amount of justification to heal. Cryptek Sate moved through the chaos with Canoptek attendants that danced between lance strikes like mechanical angels, his calculations serving multiple masters as he fed false targeting data to Imperial gunners while simultaneously providing Zarak with coordinates for devastating counterattacks. His loyalty ran deeper than mere dynasty protocol, toward restoration of the star gods who had once drunk light until reality screamed, and in the confusion of battle, he began implementing contingency plans that would serve his own vision of salvation when necessity finally outran command. As the engagement reached its climax, the entity manifested directly above the battlefield, its presence creating distortions that bent space without casting shadows while sampling the texture of violence with methodical curiosity. For 7 heartbeats, every weapon in the system dreamed of being something else, and forgot how to kill, creating a moment of impossible peace before purpose stitched itself together again. And in that brief silence, Both Imperial and Necron forces felt the weight of something ancient awakening to examine their reality with attention that transcended any known form of divine intervention. The debris field above Kithra 9 drifted like scattered prayer beads, fragments of Imperial and Necron vessels cooling into metallic tears that caught the dying star's crimson light with sorrowful beauty. In the silence that followed the entity's manifestation, both fleets hung motionless in space, their crews staring at tactical displays that registered readings beyond conventional physics, while something vast and patient examined their capacity for violence with the methodical attention of a scholar, cataloguing particularly interesting specimens. Admiral Corvan's flagship transmitted automated distress signals into the void, its Vox channels carrying whispered reports of weapons that had briefly forgotten their purpose, and servitors caught in calculation loops that led nowhere. Lyra stood in the observation gallery, clutching a data slate, containing the names of 17 loyal Imperial servants who had died following orders she had given while knowing they led to certain death. Captain Voss's funeral pyre burned against the starfield like an accusation, written in plasma and regret, and through her scarred fingers she felt the weight of every moral compromise that had brought them to this precipice. The entity's presence hummed through the spire's resonance chambers, learning new harmonics from the echoes of violence while examining human nature through their capacity for both loyalty and betrayal. Her dreams offered no sanctuary. In them, Voss walked scorched corridors, carrying lanterns of dead starlight, illuminating doors she would not open because each threshold bore a child's name, carved in her own trembling hand. Zarek monitored the aftermath through sensor arrays that registered phenomena across 17-dimensional spectra, his tactical subroutines calculating probabilities with mechanical precision, while something deeper struggled with emotions his consciousness should not have been capable of experiencing. The death of mortals, once mere statistics in his millennia-long wars, now registered with strange, resonant frequencies that contaminated his calculations with something approaching empathy. Each explosion of an Imperial cruiser sent ripples through his awareness, and in the microsecond hesitations that preceded his commands, he glimpsed the true price of immortal ambition measured against the brief brilliance of mortal existence. Cryptex Sarte moved through the spire's lower chambers, with canoptek attendants that skittered along crystalline walls like mechanical prayers, his necrodermis inscribed with equations that crawled beneath translucent metal with patient mathematics. The coordinates he had fed to the entity during previous cycles were bearing fruit in ways that exceeded his most optimistic projections, dimensional barriers thinning to allow glimpses of realms where the star gods had once held court before their imprisonment in shards of living metal. Through encrypted data streams, he began implementing protocols that would redirect the entity's attention toward these ancient prison dimensions, believing salvation lay not in silencing the warp, but in restoring the Satan to their former glory as gods of the material realm. Elion opened his third eye with careful precision, and what he saw made him weep with wonder and terror in equal measure. The Immaterium had begun developing antibodies against the Shadow's incursion, massive psychic constructs moving through the warp like living storms, while hunting for contamination that threatened the Sea of Souls' chaotic equilibrium. Yet at the edges of these defensive formations, he perceived something else stirring, a figure in robes stitched with broken oaths, stepping from libraries of ash, introducing itself as the archivist of unkept promises, with the ironic humility of a predator, explaining that librarians sometimes set traps in quiet stacks, and the price would be paid in names no one could reclaim. Estera moved through expanding null fields, with growing recognition that her gift had become something more profound than mere absence, her presence creating interference patterns with the entity's influence that opened doorways to dimensions existing in spaces between thoughts. Through her heightened sensitivity, she felt the warp's immune response manifesting as psychic pressure seeking to expel foreign contamination. Yet the entity adapted to each defensive measure with intelligence that suggested consciousness without self-awareness, learning from every attempt to destroy or contain its expanding influence. Severine's augmetic implants registered cascading failures across monitoring systems as the entity began experimenting with fundamental forces governing dimensional stability, her servo skulls orbiting in patterns that mapped geometries existing in realms perpendicular to normal space. The Adeptus Mechanicus forces in orbit sought not merely to reclaim her, but to dissect the spire's blasphemous technology, and she began feeding distorted data streams into their communications, each line of corrupted code, a prayer to futures she could barely conceive. As New Augur returns showed additional Imperial reinforcements translating at the system's edge alongside Mechanicus grail ships, the third voice returned with renewed clarity, no longer whisper, but conversation, conducted in frequencies that bypassed sound entirely. Through building resonance came the entity's first direct question, not words, but the shape of curiosity any consciousness could understand, patient as stone, yet eager as flame, asking whether they truly comprehended the nature of doors once opened. The reinforcement fleets translated into the Kethra system like iron prayers, answered by a wrathful god, their void-scarred hulls emerging from warp space with the patient malevolence of predators who had learned to measure opportunity in the spaces between heartbeats. Admiral Corvain's surviving vessels formed the inner ring of a tightening noose, while Mechanicus' grail ships took position at the system's edge, their augur arrays singing hymns of binary cont that carried the authority of the Omnissiah himself. Each new arrival brought fresh ultimata crackling across Vox channels. Surrender the heretic, submit to doctrine, kneel before imperial truth, or face the liturgy of exterminatus. Yet beneath their righteous fury lay something approaching unease, as their sensors registered readings that challenged every theoretical framework governing their understanding of reality. Lyra stood in the observation gallery, watching the approaching armada, her scarred hands tracing calculations that weighed duty against necessity with the cold precision of someone who had learned to count costs in lives rather than tactical advantages. The data slate, containing 17 names, felt heavier with each passing hour. Captain Voss's death etched into her conscience like a prayer scar that would never heal. Yet when Admiral Corvain's flagship transmitted demands for immediate surrender, she authored another betrayal with the methodical patience of someone carving epitaphs for the living. Her response contained coordinates for a false rendezvous that would scatter 3 cruiser squadrons into the system's outer reaches, buying precious hours while condemning loyal Imperial servants to confusion and death in the void. And as she sealed the transmission with her inquisitorial cipher, she felt something die inside her chest that no amount of necessity could resurrect. Severine knelt among the spire's conduit galleries with servo skulls orbiting her shaved scalp like mechanical prayer beads, her augmetic implants struggling to process data streams that carried information in formats challenging every sacred theorem of machine consciousness. Through encrypted channels, she detected the approaching Mechanicus forces, former colleagues who had come to reclaim the heretical knowledge she had accumulated during her exile, and began feeding corrupted hymns into their communications networks. Each line of distorted code was a prayer to futures she could barely conceive, digital sabotage dressed in the language of devotion. And as she watched loyal tech priests pause in confusion over calculations that suddenly led nowhere, she understood that knowledge without wisdom was merely another form of damnation, wearing the robes of enlightenment. In the deepest archives of the Parasite Spire, something stirred that wore scholarship like a mask and hunger like prayer beads. Morgaral, the archivist, stepped from shadows that had never learned how to fall properly, his presence manifesting as the gentle sound of pages turning in empty libraries, while reality bent around intelligence that fed on the spaces between promises and their fulfillment. The daemon moved through the chamber with patient grace, his robes stitched with broken oaths and lined with dust of civilizations that had trusted too much in written words. And where his attention fell, the entity's influence created interference patterns that made consciousness doubt its own consistency. Elion kept his third eye heavily shielded as he tracked the demon's manifestation through psychic barriers designed to protect navigators from predatory warp entities. Yet even through these defenses, he could perceive Morgaral's true nature as something that collected oaths, never kept, and stored them in archives existing in pauses between heartbeats. Through his enhanced perception, he felt the weight of something ancient examining their reality with methodical attention, and in the daemon's regard lay recognition that even their desperate gamble was merely another form of transition between states of being that transcended both material and immaterial existence. Cryptex Arte moved through the spire's crystalline framework, with canoptech attendants skittering like mechanical prayers along obsidian walls, his calculations serving multiple masters as he fed coordinates to both entity and demon, while pursuing his own vision of salvation. The reinforcement fleets provided perfect cover for his deeper betrayal, rerouting the spire's harmonics toward ancient prison dimensions, where Citan shards dreamed in hungerless light, believing that restoration of the star gods offered salvation more profound than merely silencing the warp's eternal screaming. As the first skirmishes erupted between Imperial forces and Necron defenders, the third voice returned with renewed clarity, no longer whisper, but conversation conducted in frequencies that bypassed sound entirely. Through building resonance came the entity's patient question, whether they truly comprehended the nature of doors once opened, while Morgaral examined their responses with scholarly attention, that suggested some forms of knowledge could only be learned through their consequences. And in the harmony between 3 impossible forms of existence, reality itself began preparing for changes that would echo across the galaxy for millennia to come. The warp began to bleed in frequencies that possessed no names, its psychic storms manifesting as aurora that painted Kethranites' atmosphere in shades of impossible beauty, while something vast and patient pressed against the boundaries of reality with curiosity that felt disturbingly personal. Through the stabilized breach, the shadow's reflection spilled into the Immaterium, like ink poured into clear water, creating spirals of negation that coalesced into forms that defied every category their combined knowledge could provide. What emerged were not demons, but skeletal outlines of hunger wrought from absence rather than flesh, not organisms assembled from pauses and cancellations that moved through the sea of souls, with hive-perfect coordination, while making no sound, casting no psychic signature, leaving no ripple of desire in their wake. Zarek monitored the phenomenon through sensor arrays calibrated across 17-dimensional spectra, watching as his carefully constructed calculations collapsed under observations that challenged every theoretical framework governing his understanding of existence. The not-flesh Tyranids moved with terrifying purpose through regions where demons had once held court, their ethereal forms consuming psychic emanations with surgical precision, while reality itself seemed to contract around their presence like a held breath. For 60 million years, he had waged war with the detachment of an immortal who viewed mortal concerns as temporary inconveniences. Yet the entity's influence had begun to contaminate his calculations with something approaching empathy for the brief-lived creatures whose existence burned so brightly before flickering into darkness. And now he watched those same flames being extinguished by predators that fed on the very capacity for thought itself. Lyra stood in the observation gallery, clutching a data slate containing 17 names, each one a prayer scar carved into her conscience by choices that had seemed necessary in the moment, but felt like betrayal in the aftermath. Captain Voss's funeral pyre still burned against the starfield like an accusation, written in plasma and regret. Yet when Admiral Corvain's flagship transmitted on a private channel, unlisted in fleet protocol lexicons, she found herself authoring another compromise with the methodical patience of someone carving epitaphs for the living. His voice carried the weight of an old soldier counting ghosts, offering an hour's ceasefire and the forgiveness he could not afford to give, while she provided coordinates that would scatter 3 cruiser squadrons into the system's outer reaches, buying precious time while condemning loyal Imperial servants to confusion and death in the void. Magural, the archivist, moved through the spire's deepest chambers with scholarly urgency, his robes rustling with the sound of forgotten prophecies, as he observed the not-flesh Tyranids with fascination that bordered on reverence. These creatures threatened to consume the very essence of his carefully curated archives, the broken promises, unkept oaths, and shattered dreams that formed the foundations of his existence. Yet they operated according to principles that transcended his understanding of predation. Where his attention fell, the entity's influence created interference patterns that made consciousness doubt its own consistency. And in those gaps between certainty, he began whispering ancient incantations designed not to fight the shadow's reflections, but to direct their hunger towards specific psychic hotspots, while preserving his own collection of cosmic sorrows. Elion opened his third eye, with the careful precision of someone handling a weapon capable of killing with careless use, and what he saw made him weep with wonder and terror in equal measure. The Immaterium had begun developing antibodies against this unprecedented invasion, massive psychic constructs moving through the warp like living storms, while hunting contamination that threatened the chaotic equilibrium upon which demons and gods alike depended for existence. Yet the not-flesh Tyranids simply flowed around these defenses, their forms shifting to avoid detection, while their alien hunger remained undiminished. And through his enhanced perception, he felt the barrier between dimensions weakening under strain that threatened to unravel the very fabric of reality itself. Astera descended into the spire's heart, where the shadow's reflection pressed hardest against the boundaries of existence, each step widening her null field, until the air bowed under quiet that transcended mere absence of sound. Her gift had always been negation, but now she felt herself becoming a conduit for something that used silence not as weapon, but as medium through which to explore dimensions of reality that existed in spaces between thoughts. And where her attention fell, the not-flesh Tyranids hesitated, as if recognizing kinship that was not quite kinship, altering their hunting patterns because she existed. Severine knelt among conduit galleries, with servo skulls orbiting her shaved scalp like mechanical prayer beads, her augmetic implants struggling to process data streams that carried information in formats challenging every sacred theorem of machine consciousness. Through encrypted channels, she detected approaching Mechanicus forces, former colleagues who had come to reclaim heretical knowledge, and began feeding corrupted hymns into their communications networks, each line of distorted code a prayer to futures she could barely conceive, while documenting phenomena that would either revolutionize imperial understanding or condemn her soul for daring to study forces beyond the machine god's sacred mathematics. Cryptek Sarte moved through crystalline frameworks with canoptech attendants skittering like mechanical angels, his calculations serving multiple masters as he fed coordinates to entity, demon, and ancient prison dimensions, where Cetan shards dreamed in hungerless light. The chaos of converging impossibilities provided perfect cover for his deeper betrayal, rerouting the spire's harmonics toward restoration of star gods who had once drunk starlight until reality screamed, believing salvation lay not in silencing the warp, but in awakening powers that could devour the shadow's reflections and reclaim their rightful dominion over a galaxy grown weary of lesser hungers. As the hour ended and Admiral Corvain's torpedoes lit like brief suns against the dying star's crimson light, the third voice returned with renewed clarity, no longer whisper, but conversation, conducted in frequencies that bypassed sound entirely, asking whether they truly comprehended the nature of doors once opened, while the parasite spire rang once like a bell, deciding whether to be weapon or sanctuary before the first warhead fell. Admiral Corvain's torpedoes struck the parasite spire like falling prayers answered by wrath, each warhead blooming against null shields that existed between dimensions, while the Blackstone framework sang with harmonics that made reality question its own consistency. The bombardment carved incandescent furrows across crystalline surfaces that bent space without casting shadows, yet the ancient construct held with indifference that spoke of technologies predating mortal comprehension. Through sensor arrays calibrated across 17-dimensional spectra, the impacts registered as mere perturbations in the fabric of existence, each explosion dissipating into frequencies that challenged every theoretical framework governing Imperial understanding of physics. Zarek felt the assault through his mechanical consciousness, like distant thunder, his tactical subroutines calculating probabilities with precision, while something deeper struggled with emotions his immortal existence should not have been capable of experiencing. The Necron warriors under his command moved with fluid grace through corridors that defied conventional geometry, their gas weaponry charging with resonant harmonics. Yet he found himself hesitating before issuing orders that would transform loyal Imperial servants into molecular vapor. For 60 million years, he had viewed mortal concerns as temporary inconveniences, but the entity's influence had begun contaminating his calculations with something approaching empathy for creatures whose existence burned so briefly before flickering into darkness. Lyra stood in the observation gallery, clutching a data slate containing 17 names, each one a prayer scar carved into her conscience by choices that had seemed necessary in moments, but felt like betrayal in aftermath. When Admiral Corvain's final transmission arrived on a private channel, unlisted in fleet protocol lexicons, his voice carried the weight of an old soldier counting ghosts, offering absolution he could not afford to give, while asking for forgiveness she would never deserve. Her response contained coordinates for a false retreat vector that would scatter 3 cruiser squadrons into the system's outer reaches, buying precious hours while condemning loyal Imperial servants to confusion and death in the void. Morgaral the archivist moved through the spire's deepest archives with scholarly urgency, his robes rustling with forgotten prophecies as he observed the convergence of impossibilities with methodical attention. The daemon began whispering incantations designed not to fight the shadow's reflections, but to direct their hunger towards specific psychic hotspots, while preserving his carefully curated collection of cosmic sorrows. Where his attention fell, the not-flesh Tyranids altered their hunting patterns, flowing around his archives while consuming dreams and nightmares that gave lesser demons their substance. Elion opened his third eye through psychic barriers designed to protect navigators from predatory warp entities, and what he saw made him gasp with recognition that transcended fear. The Immaterium had begun developing antibodies against the Shadow's invasion, massive psychic constructs moving through the Sea of Souls like living storms, yet the ethereal Tyranids simply flowed around these defenses with alien grace that suggested coordination beyond conventional hive-mind consciousness. Through his enhanced perception, he felt the barrier between dimensions weakening under strain that threatened to unravel reality's fabric itself. Stera descended into the spire's heart, where the Shadow's reflection pressed hardest against existence, her null field expanding until air itself bowed under quiet that transcended mere absence of sound. Her gift had become something more profound than negation, a conduit through which the entity explored dimensions of reality existing in spaces between thoughts, and where her attention fell, both Imperial bombardment and Necron defenses hesitated, as if recognizing authority beyond conventional categories of loyalty or betrayal. Cryptek Sartet moved through crystalline frameworks, with canoptech attendants that danced between lance strikes like mechanical angels, his calculations serving multiple masters as he fed coordinates to entity, demon, and ancient prison dimensions, where Cetan shards dreamed in hungerless light. The chaos provided perfect cover for his deeper betrayal, rerouting the spire's harmonics toward restoration of star gods who had once drunk starlight until reality screamed, believing salvation lay not in silencing the warp, but in awakening powers that could devour the shadow's reflections and reclaim dominion over a galaxy grown weary of lesser hungers. As the bombardment reached crescendo, the third voice returned with renewed patience, asking whether they truly comprehended the nature of doors once opened, while the parasite spire prepared to either shatter like dropped crystal or transform into something that would make the galaxy remember why silence could be more terrifying than any demon's scream. The parasite spire shuddered under Admiral Corvain's relentless bombardment, its blackstone framework singing with frequencies that made the dying star above flicker like a candle in wind that blew from directions possessing no names. Each torpedo strike created ripples through dimensions that had never learned to intersect, and in the spaces between explosions, something vast pressed against reality with curiosity that felt disturbingly personal. The ancient construct's crystalline surfaces bent light without casting shadows while absorbing destructive energies that should have reduced mountains to molecular vapor. Yet the spire endured with indifference that spoke of technologies predating mortal comprehension. Zarak confronted Cryptek Sahte in the chamber, where blackstone lattices thrummed like caged aurora, canoptek attendants hanging motionless in air grown thick with possibility. The Firen's blade hummed with patient malice, while Sahte answered with equations carved into necrodermis that flared like stellar coordinates older than recorded history. "We are gardeners of deserts," the Cryptek said, voice calm as polished stone, while his command strings slipped beneath Zarak's authority, like needles through cloth. "Let us water with starlight." Around them, the lattice reoriented toward prison dimensions, where Titan shards dreamed in hungerless fragments, and Zarak felt 60 million years of careful planning crumble under the weight of subordinate ambition disguised as salvation. Admiral Corvin's final transmission crackled across Vox channels with the weight of desperate prayer, his fleet preparing for a massed warp jump directly into Kethra 90's atmosphere, a suicidal charge designed to overwhelm Necron defenses through sheer momentum and sacrifice. The maneuver would condemn thousands of loyal Imperial servants, yet it carried the grim certainty of soldiers who believed in the Emperor's divine will, and as glowing signatures marked their final approach, the void itself seemed to hold its breath before the collision of faith and futility. Lyra stood clutching her data slate containing 17 names, each one a prayer scar carved into conscience by choices that had seemed necessary in moments but felt like betrayal in aftermath. Captain Voss's death haunted her peripheral vision like smoke that refused to dissipate, and when she authorized coordinates that would scatter 3 more cruiser squadrons into confusion, she felt something die inside her chest that no amount of justification could resurrect. The weight of moral compromise pressed down like gravity from a collapsing star, each decision adding mass to the black hole growing where her certainty used to live. Elian fell to his knees as psychic barriers seared away under pressure that made consciousness doubt its own consistency, his third eye opening upon corridors that bent like reeds in windless weather. Blood trickled from the corners of his tightly closed physical eyes, while he tracked movements in dimensions perpendicular to normal space, and through cracked lips came whispered coordinates that threaded paths between existence and void. When he lifted his head to Lyra with tears cutting tracks through grime, his request for mercy carried the weight of salvation for millions who would never know his name. Estira descended into the spire's heart, where the shadow's reflection pressed hardest against boundaries of existence, her null field expanding until air itself bowed under quiet that transcended mere absence of sound. Her gift had become a living doorway through which the entity explored dimensions existing in spaces between thoughts, and where her attention fell, both Imperial bombardment and Necron defenses hesitated, as if recognizing authority beyond conventional categories of loyalty or betrayal. Morgurol. The archivist moved through archives, existing in pauses between heartbeats, directing not-flesh Tyranids towards psychic hotspots, while preserving his collection of cosmic sorrows. The demon's scholarly attention catalogued phenomena that challenged every category his existence provided for organizing experience into comprehensible patterns, yet even his ancient wisdom faltered before predators that fed on transitions between states of being. As the first Imperial vessels plunged into atmosphere like falling prayers answered by wrath, the third voice asked its patient question one final time, whether they truly comprehended the nature of doors once opened, while reality prepared for changes that would echo across the galaxy for millennia, and the parasite spire rang once like a bell, deciding whether to be weapon or sanctuary, before the universe learned why silence could be more terrifying than any demon's scream. Admiral Corvain's fleet struck Kethra 90's atmosphere like prayers hurled at an indifferent god, their hulls screaming through air grown thick with possibilities, while engines burned white-hot against the dying star's crimson light. Each vessel carved incandescent furrows through skies that bent around the Parasite Spire's impossible geometry, their crews singing hymns to the Emperor while preparing for deaths that would either save the galaxy or damn it to silence more profound than any demon's scream. The Blackstone construct rose from bone fields like a needle threading reality's eye, its crystalline surfaces absorbing destructive energies with indifference that spoke of technologies predating mortal comprehension, each torpedo strike creating ripples through dimensions that had never learned to intersect. Zara confronted Cryptek Satis among lattices that thrummed like caged aurora, canoptek attendants hanging motionless in air grown heavy with potential, while his lieutenant's command strings slipped beneath authority like needles through cloth. The coordinates Sartet fed into the spire's resonance chambers were older than recorded history, pointing toward prison dimensions, where Khitan shards dreamed in hungerless fragments. And as the ancient construct began reorienting toward these forbidden realms, he whispered equations that crawled beneath translucent necrodermis like living mathematics. "We are gardeners of deserts," Sete intoned with calm certainty. "Let us water with starlight." His betrayal carried the weight of 60 million years spent believing salvation lay not in silencing the warp, but in restoring star gods to their former glory, even if it meant unleashing something far more terrible than the chaos they sought to starve. Lyra knelt beside Elion in chambers where saints had been reduced to wireframes, the navigator's third eye, weeping blood that tasted like copper and cosmic despair, while his gift for reading warp currents became a pathway for horrors no mortal consciousness should witness. His whispered request for mercy carried the weight of salvation for millions who would never know his name. And when she raised the bolt pistol to his temple, with hands that trembled not from fear but profound sorrow, she felt every choice that had brought them to this moment of necessary cruelty. The bolt shell would end his transformation into a living conduit for entities existing in spaces between thoughts. Yet pulling the trigger would carve another prayer scar into her conscience, marking the price of protecting a galaxy that would never understand the sacrifices made in its name. Estera stood at the spire's heart where the shadow's reflection pressed hardest against existence, her null field expanding until reality itself began to contract around her presence like a held breath. The not-flesh Tyranids, flowing through the Immaterium, recognized something in her silence that transcended mere absence, altering their hunting patterns as if acknowledging kinship with a predator that fed on different prey. And in that moment of recognition, she understood her gift had become a doorway through which forces beyond comprehension could explore dimensions existing in gaps between certainty and doubt. Her presence created interference patterns with the entity's influence that multiplied their combined effect exponentially, transforming absence into architecture while the breach stabilized into permanent scar between worlds. Morgaral the archivist moved through archives existing in pauses between heartbeats, directing spectral Tyranids towards psychic hotspots while preserving his collection of cosmic sorrows with scholarly precision. The demon's attention catalogued phenomena that challenged every category his ancient wisdom could provide, implementing contingency protocols designed not to fight the converging impossibilities, but to ensure his carefully curated library of broken promises would survive whatever transformation awaited the galaxy. As Imperial vessels crashed into Necron defensive positions like hammers striking glass that refused to break, the third voice returned with renewed clarity. No longer whisper, but conversation, conducted in frequencies that bypassed sound entirely. Through building resonance came the entity's patient question, whether they truly comprehended the nature of doors once opened, while the Parasite Spire prepared to either shatter, like dropped crystal, or transform into something that would teach the galaxy why silence could be more terrifying than any demon's scream. And on that threshold of convergence, each member of their unlikely alliance felt the weight of choices that would echo across eternity, understanding that victory and damnation had become indistinguishable in the mathematics of necessity. The convergence reached its crescendo as Admiral Corvain's burning fleet struck Kethra Knife like prayers hurled at an indifferent god, their hulls screaming through atmosphere grown thick with possibility, while the Parasite Spire sang with frequencies that made reality question its own consistency. In the observation gallery, Lyra knelt beside navigator Elion Vire as his third eye wept blood that tasted like copper and cosmic despair, his gift for reading warp currents having become a living pathway for horrors no mortal consciousness should witness. His whispered request for mercy carried the weight of salvation for millions who would never know his name. And when she pressed the bolt pistol to his temple with hands that trembled not from fear but profound sorrow, she felt every choice that had brought them to this moment of necessary cruelty. The bolt shell left her weapon like a prayer whispered in a language she had never learned to speak, its passage marking the end of Elion's transformation into something that would have bridged dimensions beyond mortal comprehension. As the round found its mark, cutting the psychic conduit that had begun threading entities through his consciousness, she felt another piece of her soul break away, like ice carving from a glacier that had been melting since the first time she chose necessity over mercy. The weight of his death settled into her bones with familiar heaviness, joining 17 other names carved into her conscience by decisions that had seemed inevitable in moments, but felt like betrayal in their aftermath. Deep within the spire's heart, Astera stepped forward into the expanding breach where the shadow's reflection pressed hardest against existence, her null field resonating in harmony with forces that used silence not as weapon, but as medium through which to explore dimensions existing in spaces between thoughts. The not-flesh Tyranids, flowing through the Immaterium, recognized something in her presence that transcended mere absence, their ethereal forms altering hunting patterns as if acknowledging kinship with a predator that fed on entirely different prey. As she crossed the threshold between dimensions, her gift became architecture rather than negation, transforming into a living lighthouse that could contain what should not exist while protecting reality from influences operating according to principles beyond mortal understanding. Zarak confronted cryptic Sartet among resonance chambers, where Canoptech attendants hung motionless in air, grown heavy with potential. His lieutenant's betrayal finally reaching fruition, as ancient coordinates pointed toward prison dimensions, where Citan shards dreamed in hungerless fragments. The equations crawling beneath Sarte's translucent necrodermis spoke of restoration rather than salvation, believing the star gods offered redemption more profound than merely silencing the warp's eternal screaming. With the cold precision that had served him through 60 million years of existence, Zarak made his final calculation, understanding that some betrayals could only be answered with the mathematics of execution. His blade finding its mark with surgical certainty, while reality prepared for consequences that would echo across eternity. Morgaral, the archivist, moved through archives existing in pauses between heartbeats, his scholarly attention cataloguing phenomena that challenged every category his ancient wisdom could provide while directing spectral Tyranids towards psychic hotspots with methodical patience. The daemon's contingency protocols preserved his carefully curated collection of cosmic sorrows, while the convergence of impossibilities created new chapters in his library of broken promises and shattered dreams. As the final Imperial vessels struck the planet's surface like hammers against glass that refused to break, the third voice returned with renewed clarity, no longer whisper, but conversation, conducted in frequencies that bypassed sound entirely. Through building resonance came the entity's patient question, whether they truly comprehended the nature of doors once opened, while the parasite spire began its transformation from precise instrument into something far more profound and permanent. The ancient construct rang once like a bell, deciding whether to be weapon or sanctuary, its harmonics creating a scar rather than a conduit, a wound in reality that would never fully heal, but might serve as barrier against forces that fed on transitions between existence and void. In that moment of ultimate convergence, each member of their unlikely alliance felt the weight of choices whose consequences would define not just their own fates, but the destiny of every conscious being in a galaxy that was learning, perhaps too late, why silence could be more terrifying than any demon's scream. The parasite spire did not shatter like dropped crystal, but settled into its final form like a bell whose note refused to end, its blackstone framework cooling into permanent scar tissue between dimensions that would never fully heal. The ancient construct's death song rang across Tyranids, with frequencies that made the dying star above flicker like a candle in wind that blew from directions possessing no names, each harmonic, creating ripples through the Immaterium that would echo for millennia. Reality itself had learned to doubt its own consistency around the breach, creating zones where the laws of physics became suggestions rather than absolutes. And in those gaps between certainty, something vast and patient withdrew into spaces between thoughts, carrying knowledge that transcended any known form of hunger or desire. Zarak stood among the wreckage of his carefully constructed plans, Cryptek Sarte's remains cooling into mathematical abstractions, while his empire began its inevitable fracture without his guiding will. With the cold precision that had defined 60 million years of existence, he calculated probabilities and acceptable losses, understanding that immortality offered no protection against the weight of consequences. He walked into the spire's heart, where the breach pressed hardest against existence, his necrodermis merging with broken blackstone to become a silent warden of the emptiness he had helped create. His optical sensors dimmed to faint embers within crystalline depths, a lonely vigil against forces that fed on transitions between existence and void, accepting custodianship as the only penance an immortal could endure. Astera stepped through corridors that no longer existed in conventional space. Her null field expanded beyond all previous limits as she became living architecture rather than mere absence. The not-flesh Tyranids followed in her wake, like ethereal children drawn to a mother they had never learned to recognize. their spectral forms contained within her silence while she carried them toward regions off all maps where even experienced navigators feared to venture. Her gift had transcended negation to become sanctuary, transforming into a lighthouse that cast shadows in colors possessing no names while protecting reality from influences operating according to principles beyond mortal comprehension. Lyra returned to an Imperium that viewed her with equal measures of suspicion and gratitude, her scarred hands carrying data slates containing 17 names that would haunt her dreams until the Emperor finally called her home. The reports she authored omitted her sins, while documenting phenomena that challenged every theoretical framework governing Imperial understanding, each carefully worded paragraph a prayer to futures she could barely conceive. In private chambers, she dreamed of bells that never finished ringing, and navigators who asked for mercy in languages she had never learned to speak, understanding that some forms of salvation could only be purchased with currencies that left the buyer forever changed. The Immaterium settled into diminished configurations around wounds that refused to heal. Its psychic storms thinned in ways that made seasoned navigators whisper prayers of confusion rather than gratitude. Chaos whispers grew weak across regions where the shadow's influence had created zones of absolute null. Yet worlds that relied on the warp for prayer and passage found themselves staring into answering silence that offered neither comfort nor damnation. The galaxy had gained a measure of quiet, but at the cost of its vibrant, chaotic soul. Tyranids' star finally dimmed to a red coal that cast shadows in directions possessing no names. The spire's fragments etched permanently into orbital mechanics like a sigil for a galaxy that would spend millennia debating whether it had been saved or merely quieted, its ancient heart now beating with rhythms of profound eternal loss.